"Who's there?" Silas Brody asked, his voice firm as he checked the noise coming from the back of the wagon. "Please," the woman said, breathing rapidly from behind the canvas, "pretend I'm your wife. If they find me, I'll be lost." Colorado Territory, 1885. Autumn arrived with a cold that cut through the skin even before dawn had fully broken. Silas Brody pulled his coat tighter around his chest and checked for the third time the list he carried in his pocket. He needed to buy salt, flour, nails, and a new roll of rope before the first snow closed the roads connecting Pine Hollow Ranch to the town of Silver Creek. The gray sky, overcast since sunrise, promised a storm within a few days. He didn't like going down to town. He preferred the solitary work with the horses, the smell of hay and leather, the predictable rhythm of the days on the property he had inherited from his father. Since losing his brother Owen 3 winters earlier, Silas had learned to trust animals more than people. Horses didn't lie. They didn't hide their intentions behind broad smiles the way the men who worked for Horace Blackwood did. On the main street, Silas crossed paths with 2 of those men. He recognized them by their short-brimmed hats and by what they carried strapped low on their thighs, a style Blackwood seemed to require from everyone he hired. They spoke quietly near the bank office, looking around as though searching for someone. Silas paid no attention. It was none of his business. He bought what he needed at the general store, exchanged a few brief words with the owner, a man named Elias, who commented on the weather and Blackwood's growing reputation in the region. "That man bought 2 more sawmills this month," Elias said as he wrapped the sacks of flour. "They say he wants to control the entire river, from its source to where it flows into the valley. The only thing left is convincing Miss Whitmore to sell that last piece of land." "The doctor's property?" Silas asked without much interest. "The very one. They say he invented a debt her father supposedly owed the bank to force the sale. It's an ugly business." Silas nodded but said nothing more. He loaded the sacks into the wagon and headed back to the ranch before the sun began to set. The road home was long, crossing open pastures before entering the grove of aspens that lined the river. It was only when he reached the stretch of road surrounded by trees, a few miles from Pine Hollow, that he heard a muffled sound behind him among the sacks of flour. He pulled the reins and stopped the wagon, his heart racing on instinct. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice firm. A movement among the sacks. Then a pale face appeared, green eyes wide with fear, brown hair tied untidily beneath a scarf. "Please," the woman said, breathing rapidly. "Pretend I'm your wife. If they find me, I'm lost. I'll explain everything, but keep moving as if nothing is wrong. They've been following me since the town." Dear friends and listeners of Boundless Ranch Love, before we continue our story, tell me in the comments what you're doing and what part of the world you're joining me from today. I love traveling the world with you because I love your company. I look at the mountains and can imagine us living these stories together. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now and turn on the notification bell so we can meet again and keep traveling the world together. Now let's get back to the story because speaking of journeys, Silas's is becoming very interesting. Silas recognized Ann Whitmore. He had seen her a few times before, always from a distance, at church or at the general store. He knew she was the daughter of the doctor who had cared for the region until his death, and that there were rumors about a land dispute involving her name. "You're Dr. Whitmore's daughter," he said, without lowering his guard. "I am. And Blackwood's men are after me because I refused to sign the papers he prepared. He claims my father owed money to the bank, but I've never seen a single record of that debt. If they catch me before I reach a safe place, I don't know what they'll do to me." Silas looked back. In the distance, 2 riders appeared around the bend in the road, galloping quickly, raising dust, even though the autumn ground was damp. "Stay down," he said, covering her again with the empty sacks left over from the supplies. "And if anyone asks, I'll say you're my wife. You can trust me." Anne swallowed hard but obeyed, her body tense beneath the rough canvas. Silas cracked the reins and turned off the main road, taking a narrow trail between the rocks that he had known since childhood, a shortcut his father had taught him during their hunting trips. The wagon lurched violently over every stone, and for a moment Silas feared the wheels would break before they reached the next turn. Beneath the sacks, Anne held on with both hands, feeling every jolt through her body, already exhausted from hours spent hiding among crates and sacks in town, waiting for the right moment to escape. without being seen. Silas guided the horses steadily, his eyes fixed on the narrow trail, alert for any sign that their pursuers had noticed the detour. On a particularly sharp bend, he almost lost control of the wagon when one of the wheels sank into a hole hidden beneath dry leaves, but he managed to correct it in time without slowing down. "Are you all right back there?" he asked, without turning around, his voice muffled by the wind. "I'm fine," Anne replied, her voice trembling more from nerves than from the cold. "Just keep going." Blackwood's riders continued along the main road without noticing the alternate path, and Silas only relaxed his shoulders when the sound of their horses' hooves faded into the distance behind the mountains. When he finally stopped the wagon at the edge of Pine Hollow's land, Anne crawled out from beneath the sacks, shivering from both the cold and her nerves, her hands still gripping the canvas. "Thank you," she said, adjusting the scarf over her hair. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't helped me." "I didn't do it out of kindness," Silas replied, still serious as he put away the rifle. "I did it because no decent man hands a defenseless woman over to armed bandits. But now we need to decide what to do with you, because I can't take you back to town without them noticing the route we used." Anne looked up at the sky, already darkening quickly, and at the heavy clouds gathering over the mountains, laden with a dense grey she knew well from the winters she had spent beside her father. "Winter is coming early this year," she said, in a tone that blended concern and resignation. "It is," Silas confirmed, "and judging by the way the wind is changing, the mountain passes will probably be closed by tomorrow. I'll take you to the house. Once we're inside, we'll decide the rest calmly." He didn't say aloud what they were both thinking. Anne might have to stay there, at Pine Hollow Ranch, until the snow melted in the spring. The house appeared before them a few minutes later, a simple, dark wooden building with a corral beside it, and an old sheepdog that came running toward the wagon, barking softly before recognizing its owner's scent. Anne climbed down slowly, still uncertain, looking around as though trying to understand where she would spend the coming days. "You can come in," Silas said, holding the door open. "It isn't big, but it's warm, and there's enough food for the entire winter." The inside was simple and well kept, with little furniture, a stone fireplace, and an old portrait hanging near the window, showing two men who looked alike, one older and one younger, both wearing the same serious expression as Silas. "My father and my brother," he explained, noticing Anne's gaze resting on the portrait. "I'm very sorry for the loss of both of them," Anne said carefully. Silas merely nodded without dwelling on the subject, and showed Anne the small room that had belonged to Owen, now used most of the time to store boxes and tools. "You'll have to sleep here until we decide on something better," he said. "Tomorrow, I'll straighten the room out properly, but today the priority is for you to rest." That first night, each of them remained silent in their own corner of the house, still uncomfortable with the sudden closeness imposed by the circumstances. Outside, the wind already announced the storm that would arrive before dawn. The storm arrived the following morning, exactly as Silas had predicted. Snow covered the mountain roads within a matter of hours, isolating the ranch from the rest of the territory. Anne, who had spent her first night in the small guest room that had once belonged to Owen, woke to the sound of the wind striking the windows, a sound that reminded her of the cold nights when her father was still alive, and the entire house had seemed warmer simply because of his presence. She went down to the kitchen and found Silas already awake, making coffee and checking the supplies stored for the winter. "We won't be able to leave here for weeks," he said without turning around. "If you want to go back to town, you'll have to wait until spring." "I have nowhere to go back to now," Anne replied, sitting at the table. "My home is under dispute, and I don't trust anyone else in town besides Pastor Cole and Miss Abigail, the schoolteacher." Silas nodded without saying anything more. He poured 2 cups of coffee and placed one in front of her. The first few days were uncomfortable. Anne felt she was intruding on the routine of a man accustomed to living alone, while Silas, in turn, didn't know how to act with another person's constant presence in the house. Meals were quiet, the two avoiding looking directly at each other, each occupied with their own tasks. But little by little things changed. One morning, as the snow fell more heavily, one of the horses injured its leg on a broken fence near the barn. Anne, who had learned nursing by watching her father since childhood, offered to help before Silas even asked. "Let me take care of this," she said, already rolling up her sleeves. I watched my father treat dozens of injuries like this, in both people and animals. Silas hesitated for a moment but gave in. He watched from a distance, impressed by the gentleness and confidence with which she worked, applying warm compresses and securing the bandage with a clean cloth, speaking softly to the animal as though it understood every word. "You have a way with animals," he commented a few days later, while watching Anne brush the injured horse's mane. "I learned that animals respond to patients just like people do," she replied without stopping. "My father used to say that someone who knows how to care for an injured horse also knows how to care for a wounded heart." Silas remained quiet for a moment, wondering whether that was true for him as well. He kept her words in mind, and over the following days he found himself thinking about them more than once while working alone in the barn. The weeks passed, and Anne began helping with other tasks. She repaired the torn curtains in the sitting room, mended work clothes, and organized the pantry in a more practical way, separating what needed to last through the entire winter from what could be used sooner. She also found in a dusty corner of the study several boxes containing the law books that had belonged to Owen Brody, Silas's late brother. "May I organize these boxes?" Anne asked one afternoon, pointing to the stacked volumes. Silas hesitated. It had been a long time since he had gone near that corner of the house. "My brother studied law before coming back to the ranch," he finally said. "After he died, I never had the courage to touch his books." "If you'd rather, I'll leave everything as it is," Anne replied carefully. "No, you can organize them. Maybe it's time for someone to make use of those books again." Anne spent days cataloging the volumes, reading passages about rural property, debt contracts and land titles. It was there, among the yellowed pages, that she began to better understand the methods Blackwood used to seize land from entire families, a scheme repeated in at least 3 cases Owen had defended years earlier while still practicing in Denver. At night, after dinner, Anne and Silas began sitting near the fireplace to talk. At first, they spoke about the ranch, the horses, and the weather. Later, their conversations became more personal. "I miss my father every single day," Anne confessed one evening, staring into the fire. "He treated everyone in the region, rich or poor, without charging those who couldn't afford it. That's why Blackwood was able to fabricate the debts so easily. My father never kept records against anyone because he never needed to." "He sounds like he was a good man," Silas said. "He was. And you, how did you lose your brother?" Anne asked gently. Silas adjusted the firewood before answering, his eyes fixed on the flames. "A fever that came after a trip to Denver. Owen came back to take care of our father, who had already been sick for months. They both died just a few weeks apart. I've been alone on the ranch ever since, taking care of everything the two of them built." "I'm very sorry," Anne said sincerely. "It was hard. It still is on some days. But work helps keep my mind occupied, and horses don't ask questions." Anne looked at him, recognizing a part of herself in that answer. They both carried similar losses, and perhaps that was why living together, even though it had been forced by circumstance, was beginning to feel natural. As the weeks went by, small gestures began to accumulate. Silas started leaving a cup of coffee ready for Anne every morning before she even came downstairs. Anne began setting aside the best portions of the roasted meat for him without anyone having to ask. They laughed together at the ranch dog's antics and debated good-naturedly about the best way to repair the barn roof once the snow melted. On one especially cold night, a second storm nearly tore part of the chicken coop away. Silas went out into the blizzard to secure the loose boards, and Anne, worried, couldn't bring herself to stay inside waiting. "I'm going to help," she said, already reaching for the heaviest coat hanging near the door. "It's dangerous out there," Silas replied, trying to stop her. "The wind could knock anyone down." "Then hold my hand and don't let me fall," she answered firmly. The two of them spent nearly an hour battling the wind, fastening the loose boards and gathering the frightened chickens, laughing despite the biting cold whenever they slipped in the snow. When they finally returned inside, exhausted and soaked, Silas held Anne's shoulders for a moment, making sure she was all right, and they both realized at the same time how close they were. "Stay here by the fire until you warm up," he said, his voice gentler than usual, completely forgetting the formality of those first days. "Will you stay with me?" Anne asked, still shivering from the cold. "I will," Silas replied, sitting down beside her. That night, seated side by side before the fire, with their still damp clothes drying slowly. Neither of them spoke very much. But the quiet between them was different from the uncomfortable silence of the first days. It was the kind of calm shared by people who no longer need to fill every moment with words. As Christmas approached, the ranch seemed less isolated than it had during the first weeks. Anne insisted on preparing a small Christmas dinner, using the few special things they had left in the pantry: a piece of meat saved for special occasions, molasses cookies, and an herbal tea she had gathered back in the autumn before fleeing the town. "My father always said that Christmas deserves a properly set table, even when there isn't much left," Anne said, arranging the plates carefully. Silas, who hadn't celebrated Christmas in years, brought in a small pine branch to decorate the table, cut from a tree near the frozen river. "It's not much," he said, a little awkwardly, placing the branch in a clay jug. "It's perfect," Anne replied with a smile. "It's the first time since my father died that I've felt like celebrating anything." The two of them spent the evening talking about family memories, laughing at old stories, and toasting with strong coffee since there was nothing stronger in the house. It was the first time Silas had truly laughed since his brother's death, a sound that seemed to surprise even him. A few weeks later, Anne fell ill. A high fever confined her to bed for several days, and Silas, worried, took care of her without hesitation, just as she had cared for the injured horse at the beginning of the winter. "You need to eat something," he insisted, bringing hot broth to her room despite having no skill at all with cooking. "It's really terrible," Anne said weakly, though still able to laugh at the expression of concentration on his face. "Then eat slowly and pretend it tastes good," Silas replied, sitting beside the bed. He spent nights awake, changing the damp cloths on her forehead, remembering every instruction Anne herself had taught him about high fevers, carefully applying everything he had learned from watching her care for the animals. When the fever finally broke, Anne woke to find Silas dozing in a chair beside the bed, still wearing the clothes from the previous day. "You stayed here all night?" she asked, her voice still weak. "I did," he replied, waking with a start. "I wasn't going to leave you alone while you were like this." Anne held his hand for a moment, a simple gesture that carried more than any words could have expressed at that moment. Over the following days, the two of them seemed closer, more comfortable with each other. Silas taught Anne to ride better, holding the reins firmly. Anne taught Silas a few stitches so he could mend his own work clothes, laughing at how clumsy he was with a needle. One afternoon, when the snowstorm seemed especially fierce, Anne found Silas standing on the porch, watching the snow-covered mountains. "Is everything all right?" she asked, walking over to him. "I was thinking about how empty this house seemed before you arrived," he replied without turning around. "I didn't know I had been missing this until now." Anne felt her face grow warm despite the cold. "I didn't expect to find comfort in a place so far from everything I knew either," she said. "But I did, and it's thanks to you." Silas turned to look at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The wind still howled outside, but inside the house, something had changed between them. "Trust me when I say you're welcome here for as long as you need," Silas finally said. "And if one day you'd like to stay longer than the winter, know that the door will always be open." "I'll remember that," Anne replied with a small smile. During the first weeks when the snow began to melt, leaving pools of dark water among the rocks, Silas and Anne went out together to inspect the fences around the property, damaged by months of accumulated snow. The work was hard, requiring the two of them to cut fresh timber and replace broken fence posts, working side by side, hardly needing to exchange words to understand what each of them should do. "I never thought I'd learn how to repair a fence," Anne remarked, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand after securing a post in place. "And I never thought I'd have help from someone who also knows how to read land contracts and care for injured horses," Silas replied, a rare smile appearing on his tired face. "I think we both learned new things this winter," she said, looking toward the mountains, where the snow was already beginning to reveal patches of green among the white. Silas paused his work for a moment, watching her carefully, as though trying to preserve that image in his memory. Anne with dirt on her hands, her hair tied back carelessly, her face flushed from the effort, and still more beautiful than anything he could remember from the years before. "I'm glad the storm brought you here," he said quietly, almost to himself. "So am I," Anne replied, listening carefully to every word. That evening, after the long day's work, the two of them sat on the porch to rest, watching the sun set behind the mountains with an orange glow that promised warmer days ahead. It was there, without planning it, that Silas took Anne's hand for the first time, a simple, almost shy gesture that they both allowed to happen without pulling away. "I don't know exactly when this began," Silas said, looking at their intertwined hands. "But I don't want it to end when the snow has completely melted." Anne squeezed his hand in return. When spring began melting the snow from the mountain passes, neither of them spoke openly about everything they felt beyond that moment on the porch, but both of them knew that winter had changed everything between them. One afternoon, when a snowstorm kept the two of them completely inside the house, Anne discovered, among Owen's books, a volume of poetry that had nothing to do with law or contracts. The pages were worn around the edges, marked with pencil notes in Silas's brother's hurried handwriting. "Your brother liked poetry?" she asked, showing him the book. Silas looked at the volume for a moment, and something in his expression changed, as though that memory were harder to face than any other. "Owen used to read aloud to our father during his final months, when he could no longer hold a book by himself," Silas replied, taking the volume from Anne's hands. "I would stay on the other side of the door, listening, because I never knew what to say to a man who was dying." Anne moved closer and sat beside him without rushing. "Standing on the other side of the door is also a way of being there," she said gently. "Not everyone needs words to accompany someone." Silas opened the book to a marked page and read a few lines aloud, stumbling over the words a little from lack of practice. Anne listened until he finished without interrupting. "My father used to do the same thing," she said when he was done. "He would read to patients who spent the night at our house when there was nothing more he could do for them as a doctor. He used to say that companionship healed what medicine no longer could." "Maybe the two of them would have gotten along well if they had known each other," Silas remarked, carefully closing the book. "I'm sure they would have," Anne replied with a smile. From that afternoon on, the nightly readings became part of the routine for the two of them. Silas read a few pages, Anne read a few others, and on the nights when the wind beat hardest against the windows, the voice of one of them filled the room in a way the house had never known during the years Silas had lived there alone. On one of the last cold nights before the final thaw, Anne found Silas sitting at the kitchen table, studying an old map of the property marked with his father's notes about where the pastures could be expanded. "My father always wanted to increase the herd," Silas said without taking his eyes off the map. "But I never had the courage to do it alone. It seemed too risky without someone to share the decisions." "And now?" Anne asked, sitting beside him. "Now I don't know if I feel as alone as I did before," he replied, looking at her for the first time since he had begun speaking. Anne smiled, resting her finger on a section of the map near the river. "If one day my land is returned to me, maybe we could think about that together. The river runs right through the middle of both properties, and I've always thought it made more sense to share the water than to fight over it." "I like the sound of that," Silas said, carefully putting the map away as though that conversation had just changed his plans for the years ahead. Over the following days, the two of them began talking more often about the future, without rushing, but no longer hiding what they felt for each other. They talked about improvements to the house, the horses they would like to raise, and the possibility of reopening part of Anne's former property once the dispute with Blackwood had been resolved. Every conversation seemed to bring them even closer together, as though the winter had served precisely that purpose, to build with patience something solid enough to last beyond the snow. With the thaw, the roads opened once again, and news from town arrived with the first travelers. Hank Miller, Silas's neighbor and owner of the neighboring ranch, was the first to visit Pine Hollow after the winter. "Blackwood has been asking about Miss Whitmore all over the region," Hank said, sitting at the kitchen table and accepting the coffee Anne had just served. "He knows she disappeared from town before the first snowstorm, and now that the passes are open, he'll probably come looking for her." Anne exchanged a glance with Silas. She had known that moment would come, but that didn't make the news any easier to hear. "He hired 2 more men last month," Hank continued, turning the cup in his hands. "And he's been saying that he'll present the papers to the judge as soon as the territory resumes court sessions, claiming the property was abandoned during the winter. If no one contests it in time, he may get what he wants without even needing to use force." Abandoned property, Anne repeated indignantly. He drove me out with armed men, and now he wants to use my absence as an argument against me. That's exactly the kind of thing that man would do, Hank confirmed. And it works because most people have no way of proving otherwise. I do, Anne replied, rising from the table with determination. I have the original deeds. I have Miss Abigail as a witness, and I have everything Owen wrote about cases exactly like this one. I need to go to town, she said. I can't stay hidden forever. If Blackwood wants my land, I'll face him with evidence, not by running away. You're not going alone, Silas replied without hesitation. I'm going with you, and Hank too, if he can. You can count on me, Hank confirmed. Half the ranchers in the region have already lost their patience with that man's methods. The journey to town was tense. The roads were still muddy from the thaw, and twice the small group had to detour around flooded sections, losing precious time. Anne kept the documents pressed tightly against her chest inside a leather bag Silas had lent her, as though she feared the mud or the wind might carry them away before they reached their destination. Are you afraid? Silas asked, riding beside her. I am, Anne admitted, but I'm more afraid of doing nothing than of facing Blackwood in front of the whole town. Then we'll face him together, he replied, in a tone that carried more certainty than any long promise ever could. Before they left, Anne reviewed Owen's books one more time, searching for exactly what she needed. An old record describing the proper way to prove fraud in debt contracts within the territory. She found detailed notes written by Owen himself about a similar case he had defended years earlier in Denver, including step-by-step instructions for requesting an official comparison of signatures before a judge. Your brother left everything practically ready for this, Anne said, showing the notes to Silas. It's as if he knew that someday someone would need these pages. Maybe he did, Silas replied, looking at his brother's handwriting with a mixture of longing and pride. Owen always said that the law is only useful if someone has the courage to use it. With the documents organized, Anne, Silas, and Hank headed for Silver Creek. Along the way, they stopped at the home of Miss Abigail Turner, the schoolteacher, who had kept old copies of deeds and regional records for years, including the original documents for the Whitmore family's property. I kept all of this because your father asked me to while he was still alive, Abigail explained, handing Anne a folder full of papers. He suspected something like this might happen, and he made me promise to keep these copies safe, away from the office where Blackwood had influence. With the evidence in hand, the group sought out Pastor Nathan Cole, who was known for his trusted relationship with the territorial judge. I'll personally take these documents to the court, the pastor said, carefully leafing through the papers. Blackwood has influence in town, but he can't deny original records and genuine signatures. I sent word to the judge as soon as I learned that Miss Whitmore was alive and well. Silver Creek, when the small group finally entered the main street, looked different from what Anne remembered. The streets, still muddy from the thaw, were busy with wagons carrying supplies, and the townspeople greeted one another with the relief typical of those who had survived another harsh winter. In front of the general store, Elias recognized Anne from a distance and hurried over to greet her. I thought you had disappeared for good, miss, he said with relief. All kinds of rumors were going around town, including that you'd married a rancher up in the mountains. Anne exchanged a quick glance with Silas, feeling her face grow warm at the mention, even though the rumor wasn't exactly false regarding the feelings that had begun to grow between them. Stories always grow larger than the truth, she replied, trying to maintain her composure. But I'm well, Elias, and I've come to settle the matter of my land once and for all. It's about time, the shopkeeper replied, shaking his head. That Blackwood has been spreading papers everywhere, saying the property would soon be his. A good part of the town never believed it, but he has powerful people on his side. The following day, Blackwood arrived in town accompanied by his men, demanding that Anne sign the papers transferring the property into his name. You ran away in the middle of winter and still dare to appear in public, Blackwood said, before much of the town gathered in the square. Your father's debts still exist, and the law is on my side. You forged those debts, Anne replied without lowering her eyes. I have here the original records of my property's deeds, along with the genuine contracts my father signed with the bank, all of them without any mention whatsoever of the debts you claim exist. She handed the documents to Pastor Cole, who presented them to the judge who had recently arrived in town to investigate the case, having been notified in advance by the letter Nathan had sent as soon as the snow began to melt. Blackwood tried to deny the authenticity of the papers, but the signatures and official seals were unmistakable. Hank Miller and other ranchers from the region spoke out publicly, telling how Blackwood had pressured entire families into selling their land through fear, using veiled threats and fabricated debts. "This community already knows what you're capable of," Hank said, facing Blackwood before everyone. "It's time for you to answer for it before the law." Other townspeople stepped forward to confirm similar stories. A small cattle rancher recounted that he had received a nighttime visit from Blackwood's men months earlier, warning him that it would be better to sell his land before something unfortunate happened to his cattle. A widow reported that she had been forced to sign papers she had not even been able to read properly, pressured by one of Blackwood's henchmen who insisted that the deadline expired that very day. The judge, listening carefully to every account, requested that the documents Anne had brought be compared directly with the bank's official records, which had been brought by an employee Nathan Cole had summoned the previous day. The signatures attributed to Anne's father on Blackwood's papers did not match any of the signatures he had ever made during his lifetime, a difference that anyone in the crowd could recognize with the naked eye. "This is a setup," Blackwood protested, his voice already losing the confidence it had carried before. "Anyone can dispute signatures." "Anyone except someone who has nothing to hide," the judge replied, firmly closing the folder of documents. The judge ordered a formal investigation into Blackwood and ruled that Anne's property would remain in her name until the conclusion of the case. Seeing how events were unfolding, Blackwood's men began to drift away, fearing direct involvement in the accusations. Silas remained by Anne's side throughout the entire confrontation, saying very little, but making it clear through his steadfast presence that he would not let her face it alone. "This isn't over yet," Blackwood said before leaving, looking at Anne with restrained anger. "I'll appeal, and I'll prove those lands belong to me by right." "You may appeal as many times as you like," Anne replied, "but the truth doesn't change, and now everyone here knows what it is." Over the following weeks, the investigation progressed quickly. Bank records confirmed that Blackwood had manipulated documents and threatened employees in order to fabricate the debts attributed to Anne's father. Faced with the evidence, the judge ruled in Anne's favor, formally restoring her ownership of the property and ordering Blackwood to answer for fraud before the territorial authorities. Without the support of the banks and facing the rejection of much of the community, Blackwood lost much of his influence over the region's sawmills and timber transportation. Many of those who had once worked for him, fearing retaliation, began negotiating directly with other ranchers, including Hank Miller. Unable to gather evidence to support the appeal he had promised, Blackwood eventually left the territory a few months later, selling what remained of his sawmills at low prices in the hope of starting over in another region where his name was still unknown. Few residents missed him, and the community of Silver Creek began dealing directly with the local ranchers for timber transportation, without middlemen who charged abusive rates or threatened those who disagreed with the prices they imposed. Anne, finally free from the threat that had hung over her life since her father's death, decided to remain in the region. But instead of returning alone to the old property by the river, she began dividing her time between the two properties, making the necessary arrangements to reopen her family's home, while continuing to help Silas at Pine Hollow Ranch. The first time she returned alone to her father's old house, Anne found the furniture covered with dust, the medical books still arranged on the shelves exactly as her father had left them, and an old leather bag he had used on visits to his most distant patients. She sat for a long time in the chair that had been his, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief, finally knowing that the place remained safe and that her father's memory would not be erased by men like Blackwood. Abigail Turner helped her clean the house over the following weeks, and the two of them spent entire afternoons organizing belongings, laughing over old memories, and crying at other times when certain recollections weighed more heavily than expected. "Your father would be proud to see what you've done," Abigail said one day, placing an old photograph into a new frame. "He always said you had the same stubbornness he did, only put to even better use." "I hope so," Anne replied, smiling with eyes still damp. I spent the entire winter thinking that maybe I disappointed his memory by running away like that. You didn't run away, Abigail corrected firmly. You survived, and then you fought. He would have understood that better than anyone. One peaceful afternoon, with summer already approaching, Silas found Anne sitting beside the river that ran through her land, watching the water flow over the rocks. I did a lot of thinking during the winter, he said, walking toward her slowly, and I realized I no longer want to live alone on this ranch. Anne turned to him, her heart racing. What are you trying to say, Silas Brody? I'm trying to say that I love you, he replied without looking away. I've loved you since the days I watched you care for the horses with such dedication, since the nights we talked by the fireplace, since the moment I realized this house only made sense with you in it. Anne smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. I love you too, Silas. I've loved you since you trusted me without even knowing me, since you risked everything to protect me and taught me what it truly means to have a home. Silas gently took her hands. Then marry me. Not the way we pretended that day on the road, but for real, before the whole town and before God. Yes, Anne replied without hesitation. I accept with all my heart. On the morning of the wedding, Anne woke early in her father's old house where she had spent the last night before the ceremony, surrounded by the friends she had made over the years in Silver Creek. Abigail Turner helped secure the simple veil she had sewn with such care, while two other neighbors arranged wildflowers gathered the day before, carefully placing them in Anne's hair. Are you nervous? Abigail asked, adjusting one final detail of the dress. I am, Anne admitted, looking at her own reflection in a small mirror that had been borrowed for the occasion. But it's a good kind of nervousness, unlike anything I felt throughout the entire winter. That's the right kind of nervousness, Abigail replied with a smile. The kind you feel when you're certain with all your heart that you're making the right choice. Outside, Silas waited beside Hank Miller, adjusting the collar of the new shirt he had bought especially for the occasion for the 10th time, uncomfortable with the formality of the clothing, but determined not to complain on such an important day. I've never seen you this nervous, not even when that bull got out of the corral last year, Hank joked, adjusting his own hat. That was just a bull, Silas replied, unable to hide a smile. This is the rest of my life. The wedding took place at the beginning of summer, in a small ceremony officiated by Pastor Nathan Cole, attended by Hank Miller, Miss Abigail Turner, and much of the population of Silver Creek, who had witnessed Anne's courage in the face of injustice. The little wooden chapel was far too small for so many people, and many watched from outside, seated on the grass still damp with the morning dew. Deeply moved, Hank Miller insisted on bringing one of his own horses to pull the small decorated carriage that would take the newlyweds to the celebration held at Pine Hollow Ranch. Abigail Turner, in turn, insisted on sewing a simple veil for Anne, using a piece of fabric she had kept for years, saying she had always known it would one day be used for a special occasion. After the ceremony, Anne and Silas walked together to the banks of the river that had once nearly cost her life, now a symbol of everything they had built together: trust, respect, and a love born in the harshest cold of winter, yet strong enough to blossom with the power of a new beginning. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with tables set up in the ranch yard, music played by two fiddlers whom Hank had brought from his own property, and enough food for the entire neighborhood that had helped Anne during the case against Blackwood. Abigail Turner danced with her own husband for the first time in years, and Pastor Cole offered several toasts to the health of the newly married couple, always repeating the same phrase amid laughter, that justice and love, when they walk together, leave nothing standing of the plans of men like Blackwood. Silas and Anne danced only a little, awkward with the steps, but they hardly let go of each other's hands throughout the celebration. When the guests finally began to leave, the two of them remained alone in the yard, watching the stars appear above the mountains that, just months earlier, had almost separated them forever. I never imagined that hiding among sacks of flour would end like this, Anne said, resting her head on his shoulder. Neither did I imagine I'd find a wife hiding in my own wagon, Silas replied, smiling for the first time without the slightest restraint in his voice. Anne's lands and Pine Hollow Ranch, united through their marriage, became one place, where Silas's horses grazed freely along the banks of the river that Blackwood had coveted so much, and where Anne finally found, after so much loss, the home she had always been searching for. And there, between working the land and caring for the animals, the two of them built day after day exactly what they had promised each other that afternoon by the river, a lifetime founded on trust, courage, and true love. As the years passed, the younger residents of Silver Creek began telling the story of Anne and Silas as proof that justice, though slow, always finds a way, and that one small act of kindness, like hiding a frightened stranger among sacks of flour, can change the course of two entire lives. Hank Miller loved repeating the story at community gatherings and celebrations, always ending with the same phrase, which he said summed up everything that had happened that winter. That Pine Hollow Ranch had never been the same after a storm brought, hidden among the sacks of an ordinary wagon, the right woman to fill that house with new life. Han, in turn, kept her father's old leather medical bag among his belongings, now using it to carry simple medicines and health advice to the neighbors who lived farthest away, continuing, in her own way, the legacy he had left behind. Silas kept Owen's books on the study shelves, now neatly organized and ready for any neighbor who needed help against injustices like the one that had nearly cost Anne everything. Together they transformed a story of escape and fear into a story of deep roots, living proof that the strongest love is often born precisely where no one expects to find it. Dear listeners of Boundless Ranch Love, we have reached the end of another beautiful story, where we can see that love breaks through every barrier and overcomes every injustice. And I'm not speaking only of romantic love. I'm speaking of love in a broader sense, the love that sustains friendships, that sustains marriages, that sustains every bond, the kind of love that often comes when we least expect it and becomes such a part of us that it's impossible not to let it overflow. I know many people may not believe in its existence, but I experience it every day with my husband, my children, my friends, and with all of you. And I sincerely hope that you experience it as well. Believe me, love transforms lives. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end and you're not yet subscribed, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell. I'll be eagerly waiting for your company in our next story.